Hey designers, this is Kristen from Cut File Classroom, where I teach you how to design and sell SVG cut files for Cricut, Silhouette, and other cutting machines. In this video, I'll show you how to make SVG files with score lines in Adobe Illustrator. This is something that I've gotten a few requests for, so today we're going to create a simple card base with score lines. If you want to follow along, I'll put the link below where you can download the free Illustrator practice file, which includes these finished card bases. So score lines, also called fold lines, are lines in a paper or cardstock design that are meant to be folded to form a card, box, or other 3D project. There are two different types of score lines that we usually see on SVG files. One is a solid score line like this, which is meant to be used with a scoring wheel or stylus that presses down into the paper without cutting it. This is called scoring, which allows the paper to easily fold along the scored line. The other type of score lines are dashed score lines like this card on the bottom, which is made from a series of short dashes. This uses the blade of the cutting machine to cut along the dashes, which creates a fold line that allows the paper to easily fold. Dashed score lines are used by crafters who either don't have scoring tools or prefer this type of score line because it creates sharper folds, especially for thicker materials or for more complicated 3D projects that have a lot of folds. So I'll move these over to the side and I'll start from scratch by creating a rectangle. I'll press the M key on my keyboard to bring up the rectangle tool, and then I'm going to click once on my artboard, and that's going to give me this window where I can type in the size of the rectangle that I want to create. I'm just going to do a standard A2 sized card, so I'm going to type 8 in for the width and 5.5 for the height, and I'm going to click OK. And now that gives me a perfect sized rectangle for my card. Right now this has a blue stroke color, so I'm just going to go ahead and swap that to the fill color. I pressed Shift X to swap the stroke and the fill. And now I'm going to just change that fill color to this light teal color. And so this is our card base, and all we need to do is add a score line down the middle, and that's going to give us a card. So solid score lines are pretty easy and straightforward. I'm going to press the backslash key on my keyboard to grab the line tool, or you could find the line tool over here in the toolbar. And once I have the line tool selected, I can go ahead and give it a stroke color. So I'm going to give it this blue color, and then I'm going to remove the fill color so that I only have a stroke. And then I'm just going to click and drag downward where I think the middle of this card is, and I'm going to hold Shift to make sure that my line is perfectly straight vertical line, and then I'm going to let go. So that creates this blue line that I have here. Once again, you just want to make sure that there is a stroke line with no fill color. And then I'm going to select the score line and the card shape, and I'm going to make sure that these are perfectly aligned so that my score line is perfectly in the center of my card base. So I'm going to come over to the Align panel here, and if you don't have it, you can come up to Window and choose Align to bring it up on your screen, and then you can click the Center Align option, and now we see that the score line has moved to the center of the card shape. And that's pretty much it for a solid score line. So I'm going to go ahead and save this out as an SVG, and I'm going to show you how this would work in Cricut Design Space. Just one thing I want to mention is that I prefer to make my score lines a separate color from the rest of my design, and I usually go with blue because in Silhouette Studio the user can set the operation that they want to perform based on the color of the lines. So I like to make sure that my score lines are a different color to make sure that they have that flexibility of just choosing the score lines by color and setting them to whatever score or dash or whatever they want to do in Silhouette. In Cricut Design Space, the color of this line really doesn't matter, so it's not going to affect anything if you're trying to make files that are compatible for both programs. So that's why I usually do it that way. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to choose File, Save As, and I'm going to choose SVG and make sure I'm using this specific artboard. And I'm just going to go ahead and save that out. Now these are my SVG settings that I like to use. SVG 1.1, convert to outlines, and this is the important part here. You want to make sure that your decimal places are set to 3, and then everything down here is unchecked, and then you can click OK. So now I'm going to go ahead and open this file up in Cricut Design Space so you can see how users would work with this file once they get it in Design Space. So once we get the file on the canvas, it comes in like this. Anytime you open an SVG in Cricut Design Space, the whole thing is going to be grouped together by default. So if I expand this group, I can see my card base and I can see my score line. We can see here that this score line is set to basic cut. So if the user doesn't do anything and just clicks make, the Cricut is going to cut this line and the user is going to end up with two separate pieces of paper instead of a folding card. So what they want to do is they want to come up here to the operations menu and change it from basic cut to score. So now we can see that the line has changed from a solid line to this dashed line, and this is Cricut's symbolic way of showing you that this is going to be scored. It's still a solid straight line. This is just Cricut's way of indicating that it's a score line. And then the next thing that your user needs to do is they need to attach this score line to the card base, because if they don't, Cricut's going to try to separate them onto different mats, and then you're going to have confused customers. So you want to click the top of the group, which is going to select both shapes, and then you click attach. So now these are attached, and when I click make, now I have a single mat with my card base, and then I have the score line down the middle, and we can see over here that first it's going to score and then it's going to cut the card shape. So that's exactly what we want to happen. So now to create dashed score lines, I'm actually going to make a copy of this card and use it as my starting point. So I'm using the selection tool to select it, and I'm going to press Alt or Option as I click and drag to make that copy. And I'm just going to give this a different fill color just to distinguish the two different cards here. And just like with many things in Illustrator, there is usually more than one way to achieve the same result, and this is one of those times. So in this video, I'm going to show you one way to create dashed score lines that is a bit more straightforward and works fine for simple fold projects like this card, but it's not my preferred method, and I'll talk about that a bit more later on. For now, I'll just show you a method that's a bit more straightforward. So I'll start by selecting the solid score line, and then I'm going to come up to the stroke panel. If you don't have it, you can again come to the Windows menu and find it here and to open it up. And in the stroke panel, I'm going to click this dashed line option, which makes my line dashed. It gives me a dashed line. And you're probably going to have some kind of random number here, but this lets you adjust how wide you want your dash to be. Typically, I like my dashes to be about 1/4 of an inch wide. The cool thing about Illustrator is I can actually type in 1/4 of an inch, and it'll go ahead and convert that into the equivalent in points for me. So it has converted that to 18 points, which gives me dashes that are 1/4 inch long. And it has like a default gap right now. I like my gap to be about half the width of my dashes, so I'll go ahead and type in 9 for my gap. And now we've just kind of closed that gap a little bit. So I like my dashed score lines to look something like this. And once we've got that set, we need to make this stroke weight much thinner. And I'll go ahead and I'll show you why. So right now this is a 1-point stroke weight. And even though this looks like a dashed line, we can still see this blue highlight going through because it's still a solid path. So if I switch to outline mode, we can see that this is still a solid path, and this is how Cricut and other cutting machines would view this line. So we can't just leave it like this and assume that it's going to cut as dashes. We have to actually expand this stroke so that we get separate individual dashed lines. But what happens if I come up to Object Expand and click OK is it's going to expand the stroke itself so that instead of having dashed lines, I have individual rectangles. So this is obviously not ideal. It would take twice as long for a machine to cut because it's going to be cutting each individual rectangle, and it's not really going to give us a score. It's going to give us like a bunch of really tiny cuts and get kind of messy. So I'm going to press Control Z and undo that and get back to my dashed line. So you have your dashed line set up with your dash and your gap, and so the next thing you want to do is change the stroke weight to something that's very, very thin. So I found that 0.0001 is kind of a sweet spot. So I've typed in 0.0001 for my stroke weight, and now we can, if I click off that line, it's kind of almost disappeared. Like it's very, very thin and hard to see. It's very faint on my screen. You probably can't even see it, but it's there. So now that I have this very, very thin stroke weight, now I can come up to Object and I can click Expand and click OK. And now I get separate dashes that are treated as individual paths. So if I switch to outline mode, I can see that these are separate individual lines, and a cutting machine would recognize them as cut lines and cut each dash, which is what we want. Now, they are obviously still very, very thin and hard to see, so I'm just going to select them, and they actually do expand as a compound path already, which is nice because then when they open up in Cricut Design Space, the entire dashed score line will show up as a single layer instead of a bunch of separate dashes. And I'll show you that later, but it is just really nice to note. So right now this line is very hard to see, it's still very thin, and if we come over to the swatches panel, it actually shows that this is a fill and not a stroke anymore. So we need to swap that. So I'm going to press Shift X, and that's going to swap my fill and give me a stroke line back. So now I have a stroke line, and this is a 1-point stroke. For my score lines, I typically like to come down to like 0.25 or 0.5 for the stroke weight, and that just makes it easier for the user to see. And then I can go ahead and make that stroke line black, and that's because I like to keep my cut lines all one consistent color, and cut lines are usually represented as black outlines. Okay, so now I've got my dashed score lines and my card base, and I'm going to select the whole thing, the card base and the score lines. I'm just going to right click and choose group to make sure that those two stay together. And then I'm going to do the same for the top card. I'm just going to right click and choose group and make sure that those are grouped together. So now I can go ahead and save this out as an SVG again. So I'll click File, Save As. And once again, I'll come down to SVG, I'll click Use Artboards and make sure my artboard number is typed in. And then I'm going to go ahead and save this out, and I'm going to replace my previous file and replace the previous file. And now I can go back in Cricut and let's open this up. So I'm going to replace this and upload a new file. And I'm just going to come back to this new file that I saved. So here we have the top file with the solid score line and the bottom file with the dashed score line. And I'm going to continue on to get this onto my canvas. So now I have it on my canvas. And like I said before, anytime you open an SVG in Cricut Design Space, the entire thing will be grouped together. So right now it's all one single group. So I'm just going to right click on that and choose Ungroup Once. And that's going to separate my two cards into the groups that I had them in. So I have one group that is my solid score line, and then I have another group that is the dashed score line. So once again, for the solid score line, the user would need to change this from basic cut to score. So now it looks like a dashed line, but it's still a solid line that is going to score. The user would need to put in their scoring stylus or their scoring wheel in order to score along this line. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to attach this to make sure it stays together when I send it to the mat. For the dashed score line, notice how it comes in as a single layer, and I don't need to change the operation because we do want this to cut for us. So the only thing I need to do here is click attach. So now I'm going to click make. So now we see our card with the dashed score line. And when we come over here, we see basic cut is the only operation that's happening here on this mat. So it's going to cut around the card shape, and it's going to cut each of these dashes with the blade, and that's going to give me a fold line that I can use to fold my card. And then this is the original card that we made. This is our solid score line, and we have the operation score that's going to happen first with our scoring tool, and then the Cricut will basic cut around the shape of the card. So like I said before, there is another way to create dashed score lines that I actually like better. It is a little bit more advanced and it takes a few steps to set up, but you only have to set it up once, and then you can apply dashed score lines to any path or shape with just one click. It gives you more control over your dashes so you don't end up with any dashes that are like shorter at the ends, which can sometimes happen when you're using the stroke panel method. And you can even use the same method to create other foldable projects with tabs, and it just makes your workflow so much easier. That method is something that I'll be covering in full detail inside my SVG design course that I'm currently working on. I'll even show how to make sure that the dashed score lines show up already attached to the base shape so that your user doesn't have to even worry about that step in Design Space. If you're interested in that, I'll put a link below where you can join the waitlist and get notified when it's ready. If you'd like to learn more about designing SVG files for cutting machines, head over to cutfileclassroom.com where you can find even more resources and download my free designer's guide to error-free SVGs. I hope you found this video helpful. If so, please like and subscribe, and feel free to drop any questions in the comments below. If you have any requests for tutorials that you want to see, I'd love to hear them. I'll see you next time.